They told us that if anything ever crossed North America's airspace, NORAD would know every object, every aircraft, every threat. But what if I told you there are files, sealed for decades, describing things that moved faster than any missile, hovered over nuclear sites, and appeared on radar without leaving even a trace of heat? Objects that intelligence analysts couldn't classify, generals couldn't explain, and pilots weren't cleared to even discuss. Tonight, you're going to hear the cases they never wanted you to know existed. The ones from the UFO Evidence, Volume 2. For most Americans, the idea of unidentified objects in the sky feels like a modern fascination tic-tacs, leaked footage, congressional hearings. But the truth is, long before any of that reached the public, long before smartphones and high-definition cameras, there were rooms deep inside NORAD facilities where radar operators watched impossibilities streak across their screens. These weren't rumors or late-night campfire stories. They were recorded, documented, time-stamped, and filed away behind doors labeled Special Access Only. If someone wanted to understand what was really happening above the continent, they didn't look at the newspapers. They looked at the radar logs. And that's exactly where this story begins. In 1964, when the first volume of the UFO Evidence was compiled, it shocked even hardened investigators. But what the public didn't know was that Volume 2 was already quietly forming in restricted corridors built from incidents too fast, too high, and too controlled to be explained away. These weren't eyewitness accounts. They were precision-measured detections by the most advanced air defense, network on Earth, and every decade added new pages. For years, these cases were only whispered about, spoken in hallways by radar technicians who couldn't sleep, by officers who felt something wasn't right, by analysts who wondered if the machines were telling them the truth, or if the truth was simply too large to process. But eventually, bits of them slipped through FOIA requests. Congressional pressure, accidental leaks, and those rare, brave whistleblowers who knew that silence was no longer an option. Tonight, you're going to hear the 5 core cases that became the backbone of what insiders called the UFO Evidence. Volume 2. Not the polished, public-friendly. What you're about to hear is the atmospheric, human side, what operators felt, what they feared, and what they recorded in the moments when technology and physics broke their own rules. The first case takes us to one of the coldest places on the planet. It was 1982. In Thule, Greenland, a military installation wedged into the icy crown of the Earth. There's nothing romantic about Thule. It's a quiet, brutal place where the sun disappears for months and comes back like a stranger. But the operators stationed there were some of the most disciplined radar minds in NORAD. At 2:17 a.m. local time, a single return appeared at the edge of their radar sweep 95,000 feet, descending slightly across the polar cap. At first, the technician thought it was an artifact, maybe ionospheric distortion. But then it moved. Smooth, deliberate. There was no transponder, no heat signature, no radio communication. Yet it reflected radar sharply, not like clouds or birds or debris. More like metal. Controlled metal. The operator leaned forward. A cold feeling slid into the room, not from Greenland's wind, but from something deep intuition. The return vanished. Not faded, vanished. Then, exactly 40 seconds later, it reappeared 17 miles southwest. Same altitude, same speed, same dead silence. 2 separate radar systems confirmed it. An infrared satellite caught a faint optical reflection light bouncing off a solid structure but still no thermal output. Nothing about it behaved like a natural object. The track accelerated, rapidly, more than 4,000 knots. Then it did something that would break any aircraft, missile, or drone ever built. It stopped in mid-air, at 102,000 feet, and then it blinked out of existence. After hours of analysis, NORAD logged the event as non-orbital, non-conventional, but internally, the officers just stared at each other, wondering the same thing. If it wasn't ours, and it wasn't theirs, whose was it? That question haunted them for years. But it wasn't the only time something impossible appeared on American radar screens. 9 years later, 1991, Langley Air Defense Sector would face its own mystery. Over Virginia, between two busy civilian air corridors, a primary radar return blinked into existence at 30,500 feet. No transponder, no flight plan. The return was crisp, stable, unmistakably solid. 3 long-range radar systems picked it up simultaneously. The operators watched as it drifted west for a moment, then suddenly ascended 30,500 to 36,000 feet in under 12 seconds. No jet in the United States could do that. No jet in the world could do that. But the strangest thing wasn't the climb. It was the way the object behaved once it reached cruising altitude. It paced the northern air lane, adjusting its speed to maintain distance, most like it was observing the air traffic, keeping a fixed relationship as if studying human flight behavior. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. No fade, no descent, no blip moving off screen. It simply blinked out. The official explanation: no known atmospheric or aircraft-related correlation, meaning they had no idea what it was and no label that fit. By this point, whispers inside NORAD were growing. These weren't isolated. They weren't random, and they weren't stopping. Whatever these things were, they had intelligence, purpose, intention, and they seemed to choose when to be seen. But in 2004, something even more unnerving happened, this time in Labrador, Canada. Operators in the Sagal Bay region picked up a return at sea level. That alone wasn't strange ships, whether debris could cause surface-level blips. But this one was different. It strengthened, intensified, became more defined, and then it rose, not gradually, not like a drone. It shot upward in a clean, vertical line, sea level to 98,000 feet in under 2 minutes. No sonic boom, no turbulence signatures, no aerodynamic stall. A DSP satellite caught the faintest glinchest light reflecting off a solid object, but again, no heat, no plume, nothing resembling propulsion, and then the return vanished at exactly 98,000 feet, as if it had crossed into some layer of the atmosphere we couldn't access. After the Sagal Bay incident, NORAD quietly circulated internal guidance to radar stations: report anomalies, but minimize speculation, which is a bureaucratic way of saying, we know something's happening. We just don't want anyone talking about it. But 1978 had already produced one of the most chilling cases in nuclear airspace history, and no amount of memo-writing could erase it. Over Montana, in the Malmstrom missile fields, the same region that stored some of America's most powerful nuclear capabilities, 3 radar returns appeared over separate missile silos. Identical altitude, identical radar cross-section, perfectly stable, the kind of reflections you'd expect from compact metallic craft. 2 long-range radars confirmed them, on the ground. Security teams outside one of the silos radioed in something even more disturbing. 3 white-blue lights hovered in a triangular formation, steady, unnervingly precise. One guard later wrote that the lights felt intentional, as if they were not observing but inspecting. Then the objects drifted laterally in perfect synchronization before rising straight up, accelerating out of radar coverage in seconds. When NORAD reviewed the logs, their conclusion was chilling. No system malfunction, no aircraft correlation, no environmental cause. Translation: they had absolutely no idea what visited America's nuclear fields that night. And then came one of the quietest yet most unsettling cases of all: the Gander North Track in 1997. A single primary radar return drifted into the scan pattern like a ghost, moving against the wind, slow, deliberate, steady, but it held its radar strength consistently, with none of the scattering that atmospheric noise usually produced. It behaved like metal, structured, manufactured metal. Civilian radar saw nothing, meaning whatever it wasn't broadcasting its presence to anyone but the defense network. These 5 cases spanning decades, crossing national borders, defying aerodynamics aren't stories from books or tabloids. They are recorded, time-stamped, data-verified interactions with objects that intelligence analysts still cannot classify. Each case fed into the evolving document quietly known as the UFO Evidence, Volume 2. The unofficial continuation of the investigation that began in 1964. And if you're wondering whether these 5 are the only ones, they're not. Not even close. Behind closed doors, analysts began noticing patterns. These objects appeared where human systems were strongest: missile fields, satellite corridors, key air lanes. They moved with purpose. They responded to observation. They vanished at will. They emitted no heat, yet reflected light. They reflected radar, yet produced no sonic signatures. They broke the rules of propulsion, physics, inertia. Some inside NORAD began to wonder whether these objects existed entirely in our airspace, or whether they were slipping in and out of it, not traveling across the sky, but through it, as if the airspace was just a thin veil they could choose to dip into. One retired analyst described it like this: we weren't tracking objects, we were tracking intrusions. He believed they weren't traveling from point A to point B. They were appearing precisely where they chose, almost like a controlled drop-in, an insertion into our physical reality. The data supported this more than anyone wanted to admit. Others inside intelligence suggested something even more unsettling. What if these objects had always been here, simply choosing when to reveal themselves? Not probes, not visitors, but something more like observers, silent, patient, curious. As the decades rolled toward the modern era, more cases quietly stacked into the classified Annex of Volume 2. Operators started reporting momentary blips that matched the impossible characteristics of earlier intrusions: brief, purposeful, and gone. Some objects shadowed airliners at distances too perfect to be coincidence. Others paused above restricted zones as if scanning. One radar technician in 2009 described seeing a return that moved like it already knew where our sensors were. And then there are the rumors of a pattern that nobody wants to acknowledge publicly. These objects seem to appear more frequently during moments of global tension, almost as if they are monitoring, evaluating, measuring. But here's what makes all of this even stranger. Every time a new case appears, it somehow fits neatly into the same behavioral profile as the oldest ones. The altitude ranges, the instantaneous acceleration, the right-angle maneuvers, the sudden disappearances, the absence of heat, the presence of radar reflectivity. It's almost as if these objects haven't evolved at all over the decades, as if they don't need to. Whatever they are, their technology doesn't require upgrades. It doesn't break. It doesn't change, which raises one terrifying question. How old is it? Some analysts believe these objects represent a technology so advanced that our entire concept of high-tech is childlike by comparison. Not futuristic, something beyond our scale of understanding. Volume 2, if fully released, would show the public something unprecedented, that across decades of improvements in radar, satellite imaging, infrared tracking, and military sensors, the mystery never got smaller. It only got bigger. The more our technology advanced, the more clearly we saw the impossible. But the deepest secret, the one almost no one discusses, is this. Sometimes, during these incidents, the operators felt something. Not fear, not shock, but a strange sense that the objects knew they were being watched, as if the observation went both ways. As if the radar screens weren't just windows looking out, they were mirrors. One operator from the Langley incident described it this way. When it vanished, it didn't feel like it went somewhere. It felt like it stopped letting us see it. Think about that. The idea that these objects don't just move out of sight. They make a decision. And maybe that's the real heart of Volume 2. Not that these craft exist. Not that they defy physics, but that they choose when to be seen, and when not to be, as you listen to these cases. Imagine the thousands of screens glowing in dark ORAD rooms across the continent. Imagine the faint blip of something not supposed to exist. Imagine the technician leaning closer, confused, curious, uneasy. And imagine that somewhere out there, the object pauses just for a moment, as if acknowledging that it has been detected. Then imagine it disappears, not because it fled, but because it's done watching. And that's the part that leaves every analyst awake at night. Because if these things have been here since before the first UFO evidence in 1964, if they've watched our missile fields, our satellites, our aircraft, if they've shadowed our corridors and observed our evolution, then maybe the real question isn't, what are they? Maybe the real question is, why do they keep coming back? And even more unsettling, what happens the day they decide not to disappear?